like to know is just your journey and a little bit
Wow.
about
Okay.
your background and
Yep.
just, really briefly, and how did you get here?
Well, so I am now the executive director of the Center for Marine Science at UNC Wilmington, effective today. Is officially day
Congratulations.
one. Thank you. Um, so my background comes through working with marine organisms. I have mainly, well, I've been an academic my whole life and worked with looking at animals in terms of how they have evolved in marine systems. So that was a lot of my journey, but then more towards the blue economy and what is happening there about, well, when the Deepwater Horizon oil blowout happened in 2010, I got involved with a research board that was helping fund research. BP put up $500 million for 10 years. And I mean, I was always aware of blue economy. I was always aware of, the importance of conservation and things like this. But once I got involved with that research board and thinking about things from a much broader perspective, it gave me a much deeper appreciation of blue economy. And part of that was I was located in the Gulf of Mexico, so the petroleum industry is very huge there. And you start thinking about things like sustainability, what we're utilizing from the oceans, how that is affecting local communities, and it all connects, right? So unfortunately, the oil spill happened. It was a huge disaster, obviously, but it really impacted everything from obtaining seafood from the ocean to people's jobs in the petroleum industry to public health. And it really sort of, I already knew this, but it really drove home that inextricable link between human societies and marine systems.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm really, if you take a moment to talk about what marine sciences is, and you talked about the
Mhm.
animals, and
Right.
I had the opportunity to travel with National Geographic on one of their
Hmm.
trips to the
Right.
Galapagos, and they
Right.
were saying that just the mere fact of the introduction of people
Right.
has really evolved the animals and the life. So I
Right.
don't know if many people understand that. Can you just briefly kind of talk about that cycle of
Uh,
impact?
Oh, certainly. Whether we realize it or not, we're having a massive impact. Um, Most of the human population lives close to the coast, right? And so, or close to waterways. And because of that simple fact, we have a huge impact, especially on coastal regions, but increasingly farther and farther out into the ocean. And some of these we don't even think about, right? You go to the store, you buy produce. If it is locally grown in the US or wherever, it means that it's being raised on a farm. If that farm is using fertilizers or pesticides, it is coming down the river into the oceans and affecting coastal regions, potentially affecting things like um, fishing habitat, shrimping habitat, tourist habitat, where tourists go to hang out. A great example of that are the big dead zones that we now know of in marine systems because of things like agricultural runoff, which shut down large sectors of marine systems. They're no longer productive. And so they can't be utilized, can't be involved. Another great example of how the blue economy, there's a lot of discussion now with deep sea mining. And so most people don't realize that when you pick up your cell phone, when you put in your AirPods, whatever, you are utilizing a number of heavy metals that are usually a bit more rare and harder to collect. Well, it turns out that there are some uh, regions in the deep sea where these types of metals tend to accumulate. Manganese nodules are very well known for this. There is considerable talk at the international level about allowing deep sea mining. And this is an incredibly destructive form of mining. It's basically like open pit mines just down in the ocean. And one of the challenges is the sediment gets kicked up and then smothers a broad area. So even somebody sitting in Iowa or somebody sitting in Quebec, they are dependent on blue economy without even realizing it. You know, if some of this deep sea mining develops the way it is, there's going to be more dependence on that. And basically things they do in their everyday life are dependent on marine systems, whether they realize that fact or not.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part because out of sight, out of mind, right?
Right, right,
You know, so many people don't live by the ocean and they only see the
mm,
ocean as far as they can see it and they say, well, it's big, it's vast,
right.
we can't really impact it. You know, these dead zones, can they come back alive? Can they regenerate?
Well, they can, and a lot of them tend to be seasonal, especially if they're in higher latitudes, because of just the dynamics of the ocean and the way the ocean ecosystem responds to blooms and you know, sort of the typical cycle we see on land of, you know, things come to life in the spring and they're there in the summer, and then there's usually a regression in the fall, and that happens in marine systems as well. There is hope, and we can, you know, we can alleviate some things. We just have to be willing to want to. I want to touch back to your comment about, you know, the perception is the ocean is vast and, you know, there's no way we can impact it. People think that, but that is patently false. You know, I have had the fortune to do a number of major oceanographic cruises where I go out and I'm at sea for, you know, 3 to 5 weeks out in literally the middle of the Atlantic, the middle of the Pacific. You see trash, right? You see trash there from humans. I get to do a lot of work in the Antarctic. This last cruise I was on, we were taking sediment from the Antarctic, and there's plastic in the sediment. And that is what's visible. There's certainly a good bit of work from the chemical angle, looking at things like various types of man-made chemicals that you literally find around the globe now. They're in the Antarctic, they're in the deep sea, they're in deep sea sediments. So we are having an impact. A lot of times we don't understand what that impact is. And then the other thing that happens is sort of this generational effect, right? So sometimes it takes several years for the effect to build up, right? And we are all only around for a certain time span on this planet, right? And so, you know, let's call the typical human lifespan 80 years. Well, you know, 80 years for us versus 80 years for the next generation, 80 years for the next generation, your baseline gets reset of what you consider normal, right? So I'm sure if we could bring somebody back today from, let's say, the 1600s, and we could talk to them about, you know, go to a bay or an estuary and say, what do you think of the fish population or the crab populations? They would probably be horrified because they are impacted and much less than they were, you know, compared to prehistoric levels.
Can
Right?
you expand on that?
We're all more familiar with the Arctic. You know, I like to actually go back, and some of the books I read are books about explorers, and you know, you go back and you read these books from people in the 1800s, 1900s, and they were all trying to sail across the Arctic to find this hidden passage, this hidden Northwest Passage. The ice cap in the Arctic is basically, you know, gone. I mean, it's still there, but if within the course of my lifetime. How thick that ice is and the extent of the ice pack has greatly changed, and that's all due to global climate change. Going to the Antarctic, it's just as true. The scary thing with the Antarctic is there is way, way more fresh water tied up in the Antarctic. Just bigger glaciers, a bigger amount of land that is not land, but land and sea that is tied up in glaciers. So my first trip down there was in 1999, and I went to the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the region just under South America. My last trip was basically the end of 2019. And I see obvious differences in the ice in that region, right? You look at some of the islands and they are just much more exposed than they used to be. There's been a lot of ice melt. The other thing with the Antarctic is you have absolutely huge glaciers and glacier tongues that make sea shelves that ride out over the ocean water, and these break off, right? So we get icebergs by large chunks of ice that formed on land moving out over the water. And when these break, it is really hard to fathom the size of these things, right? So I've been on a ship going by, a big ice tablet, and the boat's cruising for half an hour and we're still by the same chunk of ice. Some of the ones that have broken off recently, you hear about things being, the size of Manhattan or the size of the state of Rhode Island. We all joke that Rhode Island's very small, but when you think about one ice cube being the size of the state of Rhode Island, and then you take that and say, okay, that is about, 200-300 feet tall out of the water, plus a much bigger portion in the water, the amount of water that represents is just staggering. And we do know, we are seeing changes in sea level, right? And this is happening. And, we might think, oh, it's only, a couple millimeters, it's only an inch, that's not that much. But it really is in some spots. And when you compound that with things like storm surge or unusually astronomically high tides because of unusual convergences, it can really change some things. And I was just reading, I guess about a month ago, based on the alignment of the moon and the sun and things like that, in about 10 years, we're going to have unusually high tides. Very high tides. And so there's going to be flooding, and we're going to have to deal with it. There's no way to reverse that at this point. It's going to happen.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Baltimore. So I grew up close to the Chesapeake Bay, and actually a lot of what really got me, especially into marine sciences, was some things I did in high school associated with the Chesapeake Bay. And it was interesting. So my formative years were 70s and early 80s. When we got to the 80s, we had horrible music. But I grew up, I remember when I was very young, my parents, I'm 4 and 5 years old. My parents had a place on the Chesapeake Bay, and they sold it because the water got so polluted. The Chesapeake Bay went through a time when just there was very little regulation on what was being done upriver or in Baltimore Harbor, and the number of chemicals being dumped in was just really quite staggering. One of the iconic fish populations, rockfish or striped bass, basically dropped down to nothing. Oysters dropped down to very little, and crabs. Baltimore is famous for its steamed crabs. They got fished out as well. And I was a little bit too young to appreciate this, but that was within a decade of Rachel Carson's, famous book. And so I grew up in an area close to water, and I grew up at a time where I probably couldn't have enjoyed it as much as I would have liked. Fortunately, things have done a lot better. I got involved with a group called the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who have been very vocal advocates for trying to clean up the bay and improve it, and reminding people that they're very tied with the bay and involved in what's doing it. I mean, another example of where people might not think about it, one of the main polluters in the bay at that point was a paint factory. And you know, everybody uses paint, right? You paint your walls in your house, whether you're sitting on the water or whether you're 1,000 miles inland. So anyway, I grew up in Baltimore, and then being an academic, I sort of bounced around. I spent some time at Wake Forest for my undergrad, which is my first introduction to North Carolina. I've had family here, but I am new to Wilmington, and I love it so far. It is great, and I'm really looking forward to it.
What do you, and I think your perspective of being new, what could the blue economy, and you can define that however you want to define that, what is the value, or what's the potential value for a community like Wilmington?
It's huge. You know, you look at Wilmington, to me, Wilmington has a special place given its location right on the east coast of the US. You know, to get to a city of comparable size, I guess you have to go all the way up to Norfolk, Virginia, which is pretty far north, and probably down to Savannah to get something comparable that's literally right on the coast. I think, well, so let me back up. Blue economy, to me, blue economy just means economy that is somehow dependent on marine systems or water systems. There are a number, as you know, a number of different definitions, and people define it differently. The one thing I really like about the term the blue economy is there is a recognition that we are dependent on marine systems. There's a recognition there are a lot of resources in marine systems. And usually when people use the term blue economy, they are also thinking about sustainability. They are thinking about doing things in a way where we can responsibly utilize the environment and do it in a way that is sustainable and doesn't cause too much long-term damage, right? So what does that include? Well, you know, a lot of people, when they, I guess to the layperson, I would imagine when they think of blue economy, the first thing they're going to think of is fisheries and things that we directly pull out of the ocean. Another big sector of the blue economy, at least for me, is energy and energy efficiency. Part of that comes from my first permanent job was at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and there was a lot of discussion at the time about wind farms and wind farms offshore, and how that would affect things and how that would be involved with the blue economy. One of the nice things about coming to Wilmington, I think some of the discussion of blue economy centers around things like obviously tourism. I mean, Wilmington is very dependent. Wrightsville Beach is very dependent. Carolina Beach on bringing tourists in. The tourists are coming not to see the buildings in Wilmington. They are coming to sit out on the beach and look at the ocean and enjoy the water. The food scene helps too, of course. But they're coming to interact with the ocean. So tourism is definitely part of the blue economy. At CMS at UNCW, one thing that we're very much trying to focus on, and CIE is doing this too, is some of the products that can be generated from the ocean in terms of things like pharmaceuticals or natural products that might have benefit to society. So that's all blue economy. I think that one of the other values in the term is it reminds us that not everything just comes from land, right? There is this whole bigger part of the planet that we are utilizing that is very important to human societies.
What are some of the first things that they need to do? The leaders and those coalition of the willing.
So leaders and coalitions of the willing. So there's obviously a huge educational aspect here, right? So a lot of people don't even realize they're using the blue economy or are dependent on the blue economy. And I think awareness is huge. As we try to make the blue economy a more important part of our lives or take advantage of opportunities, uh, this is sort of a larger bandwagon than maybe you were expecting, but I think people have to return to trusting the science. I think societally, we have had a very major problem with people not trusting experts in their field. Um, I'll put it this way. For example, if you want to learn how to play the piano, you go to a piano teacher. If you want to learn how to do math, go to a math teacher. Speak Spanish, you go to a Spanish teacher. For none of those things do you go, to somebody who has very little experience about it, whether it be a politician, your next door neighbor, or somebody else. I think we need to, I think it would be great if Wilmington worked on reminding people that as we focus on the blue economy, as things get developed, there are reasons we're going in the directions we're going. When we talk about sustainability, it's not just people saying, oh, we need to do this. There are really profound reasons we need to think about this. And there is really strong science backing it up. And so to me, there's an issue of regaining the public's trust. The almighty dollar, of course, drives a lot of things. And I think a lot of people are, well, what's the cost to me? How much is it going to impact my wallet? I think a great example there is going to be electric cars. That's not necessarily blue economy, but it's taken a while, but we're starting to see a transition to vehicles that are more efficient or are electric. And we're going to see probably in the next 2 or 3 years a huge jump in the availability of these types of vehicles. And it is going to be in a dollar value where it's still economical, right? We probably also have to realize some things like, especially with energy and carbon capture, there are real costs to those. It may not be like you go in a shop and lay down your money all at once, but if we don't pay attention to, example, methane and carbon emissions, you're going to be paying for it in increased flood insurance rates. You're going to be paying for it in increased hurricane. And so some of this developing the blue economy is, there is certainly a direct consumer side to it with items that are purchased, but there's also a huge science side and sustainability side to it, where we want to employ better, weather buoys, weather satellites. We want to be able to track storms better. And if we can do that, that helps everything, right? If we can do a better job of not having flooding, if we can do a better job of predicting where hurricanes are going to go, that's going to impact the tourism dollars or the homeowner's bottom line as well.
So I'm glad you brought up science and the trust of science. So many people think that science is an end state. It's not necessarily a journey. Can you talk about that very briefly, of the scientific journey?
Yeah, so certainly. I mean, all right, so everybody at some point in school, I don't know what grade level it is, but at some point they hear about the scientific process, and right, you make a hypothesis, you collect observations, you test your hypothesis. And it does work like that, but science is an ongoing process, right? We are constantly learning, we are constantly getting new insights, and we are constantly refining what we know, right? And so the way scientists works is we take, our best guess with something, right? And if that guess turns out not to be correct, we need to refine and rethink how we do things. Science is moving incredibly quick now, like in the last several decades, and there are reasons for that. One of the big reasons is computers and the ability just to analyze more data faster and larger data sets, so we get much better insights into things. And this is happening on my lifetime, and so I do a lot of genetics work, and what we know now versus what we knew 5 years ago versus what we knew 10 years ago has changed radically. Doesn't mean what we knew 10 years ago was wrong. Some parts of it were wrong or not accurate, but usually the general ideas are right. It's just the little things we're tweaking. So I guess a great example of that journey is climate change, right? So we have known, and there were people talking back in the 50s and 60s about increased carbon dioxide and, hey, maybe this is affecting some things. We figured out the temperature was increasing. What we may not have had a good handle on is how quickly it's increasing, or what some of the side effects are. And as time goes on and we learn more, we can refine those things. Now, especially with climate change, science, it really is a process, because, it is so fundamental to how it's going to, climate change is so fundamental in that it is going to impact human society on such a large scale that we are trying to forecast, we are trying to make predictions. The predictions we make are dependent on the models we use. And as we learn more, we refine those models, right? And so it may seem like to some people that the answer is always changing. And my comment to that would be, the general message is still the same. It's the details that are changing. And that is part of the scientific process. People like to try to make things polarized, that they'll often take an issue and make it such that there are two sides. And especially in science, they'll say not all scientists agree. Well, that's true. Not all scientists agree, but that is part of the process. Part of the process is debating it and talking with each other and trying to figure out which arguments are valid, which arguments are not valid, which data seem to be robust and fit with our understanding, and which data seem to tell us something else is going on. So
you mentioned a very important word, which was trust.
Yeah.
And so how do you do that, especially as a scientist, especially as, now that you've got this leadership role in a very important science for the blue economy? How will you build that trust?
So that's great. I think some of it is demystifying it, and I'm not going to blame it all on them, but Hollywood doesn't help, right? You have shows which are very popular, like CIS and stuff like this, but it's always sort of, the more Big Bang Theory is a great one to pick on, right? The top scientists are all these super nerdy, super geeky, awkward people. And that's not the case, right? Most scientists are everyday people. They do the same things. They have kids that go out and join the soccer team, or they go shop at the same stores you do. They're normal people, right? And they are just very good at the area they have decided to focus on. And they know that area usually better than anybody else. And so, again, if you wanted to become a virtuoso pianist, you would go to the people who know the most about teaching piano and playing piano. You would not go to, Aunt Mabel's piano lessons down the road. So I think some of building that trust is demystifying science and the scientist. I do think scientists and a lot of the funding agencies are actively working on this. Scientists can do a much better job about engaging the public. There are challenges to doing that because you need time to do your work, and it also takes time to engage the public. And again, as with everything else, different people have different skill sets, and some scientists are better at being able to translate what they know into a language where it's more easily digestible and understandable. Some scientists are not as good at that, right? And so part of what I'm going to be trying to do is actually get out there, talk to people, introduce them to the science, introduce them to the scientists, and say, and explain to them. The other thing that I think can happen, which doesn't help anybody, is, we need to take the time to explain stuff, and people have to give the time to be willing to listen. So that is very important. So that's what I'd like to happen. In reality, I think a lot of really addressing the blue economy and why the blue economy is so important is also going to be explaining to people the financial side, especially. So it's one thing to reach an individual. It's another thing to reach a company or the culture at a company, which have very different motivating factors than individuals, right? And so there's going to be educating lay people, but there's also going to be talking to companies about maybe, opportunities or how they might change their practice or how they might pull in some particular aspect that is part of the blue economy and how that's actually a benefit to them. It's not only a benefit to the environment, but it's a benefit to their business model. And that's there, that's starting, that's happening. To me, again, I guess I get stuck on energy. One area that's happening is solar use, right? We're starting to see a lot more companies realize, hey, solar power, it's not so bad. In some areas of the country, it's reasonably priced and you can do it. And it adds a lot of benefits in terms of reliability. For example, in California, it adds a lot of benefits because you're less reliable on a overtaxed electrical system framework.
I love that. You want to get in the community and have that conversation. Right. Do water people that understand the ocean, understand water, do they have a responsibility? Those people in Wilmington, do they have a responsibility to go inland? I mean, I live in Salt Lake City. Should we be educating people in Salt Lake City about the benefits of the ocean and the blue economy?
Well, you got salty water there, so you're all set, right?
Right.
It's just really salty.
Really salty.
Yeah. I look, this is a global problem. Right? Well, so sorry, the blue economy is not a global problem. How our oceans are being treated and sustainability is a global problem. I think it is important to realize that the blue economy has global reach. I think it's important to realize that when somebody in Salt Lake is in the mood for sushi rolls and they want to go down to their local store or restaurant and get some nigiri or, roll their sushi in some of the nori seaweed, that's blue economy, right? That has to be raised somewhere, that has to be harvested from somewhere. And it is not being harvested from, wherever, the middle of Kansas, right? It is coming from blue water. And so again, whether they realize it or not, they are connected. So they need to be aware, right? So again, a lot of people love shrimp, right? And it's very easy now to go and get a big bag of, frozen shrimp or something like this. What they may not realize is that some of that shrimp is part of the blue economy. It is coming from maybe a Southeast Asian country where they've knocked down several mangroves to build shrimp ponds. And so there's a sustainability issue there. And I will apologize because I keep focusing on sustainability and sort of environmental damage. I also should stress that there are a lot of resources coming out of the blue economy that are not damaging or that have the potential to really help us. And again, things like natural products, discovering new things. I was actually just listening to this podcast the other day from Science Magazine about barnacles and the glues barnacles make, right? And so barnacles are incredibly good about sticking to any surface, whether it be a rock, whether it be a piece of seaweed, whether it be a whale, right? And some scientists took advantage of that and looked at that glue. And now the glue from barnacles is being used as it's being explored as a possible treatment for handling wounds and cuts to stop bleeding. Because when somebody has a cut, as we all know, the way you stop bleeding is you put some pressure on it so it'll coagulate. Well, coagulation takes several minutes. It was very exciting to hear this podcast because this barnacle glue, they put it on and within like 10 seconds, it seals up the wound.
Wow.
And they've advanced it to trying it in rats and pigs. I haven't tried it in human yet because they're still working some things, but that's blue economy, right? That is taking a marine organism, looking at the natural products that are there, and it may have this absolutely huge potential for medicine. If I may, just one other example is green fluorescent protein, right? So, in science circles, this is definitely well known, and other people have probably seen it elsewhere, but organisms where part of the organism is glowing or lit up with glowing, a lot of this is used in developmental studies, but other physiological studies, neurological studies. And green fluorescent protein comes from jellyfish, right? It is this protein that was harvested that has the ability to glow when it's hit with UV light. And it totally revolutionized whole fields of science. Ended up being, it ended up resulting in a Nobel Prize for some people, and has turned into a major, billion-dollar industry. And this is coming from marine organisms.
What are some of the products of that industry, that billion-dollar industry?
Oh, so some of the products are, you can take this green fluorescent protein and conjugate it to other molecules. It can then be used to do things like track how nerves are growing. It can be used to track how, pretty much now with the genetic engineering we have, you can pick your favorite tissue, your favorite set of cells, and follow how they develop. And what that has led to is a better understanding, for example, of how some developmental diseases come about and what the effects of those developmental diseases are. And once you've used things like this protein to understand that development, and you understand the processes that cause that, you can then start to develop treatments or cures or things like that. So it's not always that this product is being, let's say, used directly in humans, but it has fed into a number of research questions which have led to major advances in numerous types of disease and disease processes.
What is your greatest hope for the future?
My greatest hope and concern is sustainability, right? I want us as a society, as a species, to finally figure out how to get into a much better space where we are not damaging and destroying the environment. I think there's a little bit more to it. And so the term blue economy is sort of interesting because if you do things like go to Wikipedia, it talks about economic growth using marine products and marine systems. Okay, and I understand that's the general definition. But when the pandemic, it's hard to remember when the pandemic started. There was a phase early on in the pandemic where the economy sort of leveled out and growth stopped and stuff like that. And there were actually a number of articles at that point about, you know, why is it that economists always talk about growth, growth, growth? And it's because everything is relating to money. You know, growth brings in more money. I would love, or my hope is that we would get to a point where we could talk about not economical growth, but either economical happiness or economical sustainability. Not everything needs to grow all the time forever, right? Presumably there's a point where we have enough of what we need, where we, you know, we don't need more and more and more, but we have a system where everybody has enough and is happy and is, you know, content with that. Now, is that a dream? Yes. Is it pie in the sky? Yes. But I do worry a little bit about the culture of, you know, economic growth, economic growth, economic growth versus economic sustainability, economic happiness. You know, if everybody is content and we have what we need, why do we need to continue growing?